So thank you again for coming here. Oh, thank you. To this lecture today. This is the third lecture in a series of lectures that we are doing to commemorate the 200th anniversary of the First Vision in conjunction with the exhibit that is on display here in Special Collections just outside the doorway here. And we are hoping to just to let you know, so this one is being recorded as all the other ones have been, and we plan to try to post links to this this lecture and all the others on the website, on our exhibit website soon, but they're also available other ways. So if you're really interested in not only the link to this one but the other ones, please feel free to contact myself or my colleague Garrett Van Dyke, who co-curated the exhibit. We'd be happy to share that with you. Just to let you know, as far as future lectures, there will not be any lectures in December, but we do hope to continue in January and possibly up to April. Hopefully to have one each month. We'll see how we can plan that out. It's just one more way for you to help or to provide a way for you to celebrate and this wonderful anniversary commemoration that's coming this next year. But look for announcements for that, hopefully in early January, for the date and topic of the next lecture. But today's we are happy and honored to have Dr. Keith Wilson and his student Katy Pratt Sumsion. Is that correct? Okay, just make sure I pronounce that. Here today to talk on, and they're co-presenting today a lecture or presentation titled "The First Vision: A Historical Analysis Between the Community of Christ and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints." Keith J. Wilson is an associate professor of ancient scripture at Brigham Young University, where he regularly teaches courses in Book of Mormon, New Testament, and Old Testament. Professor Wilson was born in Ridgecrest, California, the fourth of 10 children. He served an LDS mission to Vienna, Austria, and received a BA and an MA here at Brigham Young University. He received a PhD in educational administration from the University of Utah. And his research specialty is institutional change, and is currently researching writing about the fundamental changes in the RLDS Church over the past 60 years. Katy Pratt Sumsion grew up in Omaha, Nebraska, and she is now a senior at BYU studying English with a family life minor and will graduate in April. Her goals for the future include attending business school, helping her husband start a business, and becoming a mother. So will you please welcome with me Dr. Keith Wilson and Katy Sumsion.
Thanks, Ryan. I appreciate your introduction and the extra time it gave me to prepare, and Heather for your prayer, especially that we'd be at peace, because right now I'm waiting for that prayer to be answered. I appreciate also those of you that have come, colleagues and students, and particularly the designation that stuck most in my mind is Friends of the First Vision. Those of you that want to know more about the First Vision and to have the consciousness of this reawakened within your own faith paradigm. And so it's a pleasure to speak to you today. I'm also really grateful that Katy's joined me. Usually we wouldn't have a student presenting in a forum like this. I leaned on our two archivists, Ryan and Garrett, to have her present, because every time you ask a question towards the end of this presentation and I don't know the answer, do you know who will? Katy will. She's been my right hand in terms of this research project, and she's quite skilled with computers and searching, and I'm just indebted to her. And I'd feel like I was a little bit of a facade up here presenting this research without her being here. And so I really tip my hand to her because she's still got all her other undergraduate classes and everything else that she's had to worry about this week. I hope as you came in, just as Ryan mentioned, that you took note of that display. And my guess is if you're attending this kind of lecture that you've noticed it before. and that it's adorned with beautiful artwork, really insightful artwork. Anthony Sweat has given one of the lectures already, who presented some of those scenes. And then if you walk into the display beyond just the entrance to it, you'll see that right in the middle of the display is are the 4 accounts of the first vision, and the 4 dictated accounts from the prophet Joseph Smith. That display is a great reminder of what we want to try to frame and explore today, and that is, what do we mean when we say the first vision, and how has it been applied in the church? But another reason, I think, why, if you happen to catch some of the university announcements for your attendance here today, might be the fact that it hasn't been that long, i.e. 4 to 5 weeks ago in current memory, that you listened to the closing talk in General Conference. And you heard there President Nelson say, the next conference is going to be a really special, different from any previous conference. And then he made a great statement there that I just wanted to play for you to reinforce some of the motivation that you've already felt, okay, in that. Let's see, we need some sound. Where would be
Bicentennial year. General Conference next April will be different from any previous conference. In the next 6 months, I hope that every member and every family will prepare for a unique conference that will commemorate the very foundations of the restored gospel. You may wish to begin your preparation by reading afresh Joseph Smith's account of the first vision, as recorded in the Pearl of Great Price.
All right. The only thing he forgot to mention is you may wish to begin your preparations by attending special lectures on the first vision. But it fits so nicely that the library has established this lecture series as we approach this next April in the church, and the commemoration of perhaps one of the seminal things in our faith, namely the first vision. Now, as we begin talking about the first vision, you might be aware, if you listen to Stephen Harper's lecture a month ago, which, by the way, is on video on the library's YouTube posting there if you missed that, and it was just excellent. And I don't mean to be deprecating, but you missed a really good one if you didn't see that, and so you'll want to dial that up. But Stephen brings out in his research that the earliest time in which in the church consciousness we even cited this vision as the first vision was in 1849. Okay, and so what he's highlighted with that, and in other things that he brings forward, is the fact that we refer to it as a vision, but really it was a vision with multiple accounts. And so today, as we set the stage for exploring how we've treated the first vision, we need to kind of establish how we came to the account of the first vision that we refer to most frequently, and how others' accounts have actually influenced that account also. So we want to lay a little groundwork there. It'll be redundant for some of you that are good first vision aficionados or scholars already, but let me quickly take you through that as sort of by way of introduction. Okay, so here's our display out there with Brother Sweat's artwork, and then the whole idea of the first vision accounts. Most of you will be aware, I even mentioned it initially in my introduction here, that there were 4 dictated accounts that were meant to be recorded or written down. There were quite a few secondary accounts, and they number upwards, by the time you put them all together, up 11 or 12 or 13, depending on how you treat very similar accounts and things like that. But there were 4 primary accounts that it appears the prophet intended to have written down. Okay, now one of the best places for information and more depth, and I'm just going to skim over here, is none other than the church's Gospel Topics essays. Okay, where it treats the 4 vision, and if you haven't looked there, you've missed a real nice quality source for a discussion about the first vision. All right, in these 4 accounts, just quickly, we have the 1832 account, which was the one that was probably the least known for us up until just 30, 40 years ago. It was an account that Joseph Smith wrote with his own hand, and it was a short account, and it was mostly an account focused on Joseph trying to come to an understanding of his own position before God. It was very Enos-like, if you can kind of bring that view in from the Book of Mormon, where he went in search of an absolution of his sins and a remission of sins and finding his presence before God. It wasn't highly descriptive about the nature of God or about the persecution or the satanic opposition. It was just that, a short description. It came west in a trunk and was not really known, and it was housed in church archives until it came to light in the mid-1960s. And then it was published in some church accounts by 1970, and since then it's been widely known and referred to. Today, when you walk into the church's the Church History Museum, where you have the first vision there in the panoramic display, it is blended right into that account. And also, if you go over to the JSB and you look at the Arvard Fairbanks bronze statue there of Joseph Smith praying in a grove-like kind of setting, by the window there, the plaque that commemorates the vision and the dedicatory plaque is referring almost solely to the 1832 account. So we're using it more, but initially it was buried and not really talked about. Even though there are references where Joseph talks about it, and he's blending accounts, and some of the information from this account is coming into other accounts. Okay, but the second account that's given is the one also that's probably the least referred to, and this is actually a series of accounts in and around 1835 when Joseph recites the vision and has it written down to visitors that come. Robert Matthias and Erastus Holmes, and it's retold in almost exactly the same format. It's also very short. It does have some extra details that the other accounts don't generally mention. Namely, it mentions angels being there in the first vision, and it has this description about the leaves and the leaves being consumed or burned. Okay, so those are coming from the 1835 account, but once again this account was pretty much lost from the consciousness of us as saints, okay, even though it was given during those times and it was recorded. The account that we're most familiar with in the recitation of the first vision experience is the 1838 account. This account was begun by the prophet formally with a scribe in 1838, and because of persecution there in the Missouri period with the extermination order and the prophet being thrown into the Liberty Jail and spending the winter there, the account was suspended just after it just barely was started, and Joseph started to dictate it. It was done with a very formal purpose of this being the account for the church, but then after he escaped from prison in 1839, starting in the spring and finishing by about June of 1839, Joseph is able to complete that account with the scribe. I think it's Mulholland. But anyway, and this one becomes then our formal account. But it wasn't the formal account for all the saints during that time period. They knew very little about it. Okay. Now Joseph, it wasn't like he was trying to hide it, but he would just share these on occasion in an informal setting. The last of the accounts that was given or dictated was the familiar Wentworth account, and this one was the 1842 account. Wentworth sent a letter or came to him and was seeking to have an explanation of the Mormon Church and the rise of the church and what it believed in for the newspaper article. The newspaper article was never written, but the account was written down there, and then it was published in the Saints magazine or newspaper, the Times and Seasons. So this one was the first published account. It followed the 1838 account quite closely, but it was a little more brief and the likes. And this is also the account where the 12 or 13 Articles of Faith were first published. Okay, so those are the four accounts that were dictated accounts. Now there are other accounts in which secondary people heard the prophet talking about it, or it was passed on from somebody else, and they then write it down. And so those are also considered by scholars in trying to get a comprehensive first vision account. But of course, the ones that were dictated are much higher on a primary kind of document type scale. All right, so we have the 4 accounts. The last one is the first one published, but it's still just 2 years before Joseph is murdered in 1844, and the saints are not really aware of the first vision as a body. So that puzzles us because it's such a prominent part of our theology today, as we want to show in our research. And so the question comes up, why? Why wasn't it talked about right at first? This gives people and detractors from our faith great license to say Joseph Smith is just inventing this stuff, okay? And it's a late addition, all right? But good scholars have looked at the text, and they have realized that early on, the point of coalescence of the church and the restoration and the message really was the Book of Mormon. And the Book of Mormon was the prophesied event. Revelations 14:7, I saw another angel flying through the midst of heaven, bringing the everlasting gospel. And so the Book of Mormon became the tangible evidence of the restoration. Okay, and it was the point, really the nexus point for the early church. Now there were other things that scholars have noted, and one is that the early church was anti-creedal. And that kind of came, ironically, from the first vision and that experience and the atmosphere of creedal Christianity. And Joseph openly rejected that. Creeds being something that it was a prescribed statement that you would say as an active and participating member of a faith. Okay, and so the Methodists and the Presbyterians and the Lutherans, they all had a creed, and Joseph was taught that creeds are an abomination. So there was a spirit that pushed back against formalism in the early church, and the doctrine or a recitation of the first vision and belief in that would have seemed very similar to a creed. And so Joseph Smith, even when he publishes the first edition of the Doctrine and Covenants, there was a statement there discounting the fact that this was not a creed, even though he was bringing forth these revelations. Isn't that interesting? That's kind of foreign to us today, okay, because those things have become so seminal. But there was this spirit in the early church. Also, there was another feeling that doctrine was not tightly defined in the early church. And this comes even from a reading of the Book of Mormon. The nature of God in the Book of Mormon is very similar to the nature of God in the 1832 account. God is not seen as the Father and the Son. 95% of the references in the Book of Mormon are referring to a singular God or a generic reference to God, the supreme being or intelligence. And there are other places in the Book of Mormon where Jesus Christ even is kind of seen as a almost a Trinitarian type of person. Some anti-pieces of literature look at Mosiah 15, where it says Jesus is both the Father and the Son, and they say, you Mormons believe in that. Well, this is part of the early doctrinal presentation of the Restoration where it didn't differentiate. Our D&C 130 was given, somebody help me, 1843 is which says the Father and the Son are separate and things like that. So early on, there was eschewing this creedal feeling, and there was this feeling that the gospel was being brought back and restored. The Book of Mormon gave reference to that, but it did not lay it out just in kind of a systematic theology, as some would say. All right, so what changed then? The death of the prophet, and we have, okay, so here's some of these. As the prophet dies, an apostle of the church in 1840, prior to his death, met him en route to Great Britain, Orson Pratt, and he must have visited with the prophet Joseph Smith, and the prophet Joseph Smith must have really had the 1838, 1839 account on his mind and shared it with great detail with Orson Pratt. because Orson Pratt went right over to Scotland and he published a tract, a missionary tract called An Interesting Account of, what is it, Stephen or others, of Revelations and Visions, something like that. He publishes this tract, I think it was like a 21-page tract, okay, in which he puts forth the essence of the first vision there, largely from the 1838 account. And Orson Pratt is a great missionary and a great defender of the faith there. He spends almost 10 years there in Great Britain, and he uses that tract to present the message of the restoration. And so at the end of his tenure there, another apostle follows him, Franklin D. Richards, and Franklin D. Richards takes the next step, and he publishes a formal pamphlet with the revelations of the first vision, and also Joseph's revelations in translating the Bible, the book of Moses, and the book of Abraham, and that pamphlet is called The Pearl of Great Price. And so the Pearl of Great Price is first formulated there in England with Franklin D. Richards as a missionary pamphlet. Orson Pratt has laid the groundwork and brought much of that information, and then it's published. So he goes along there in England. Orson Pratt comes home, and his focus again and again is on the first vision. And he defends the church from that. Now, I don't want to be too deferential here, but if you want to go into more depth of these things that I'm reciting for you, you need to look at our previous speaker's book that's just been published. It is outstanding. Okay, it's called First Vision, Memory and Mormon Origins. And he just, and in the book, Stephen makes this statement: the number one person, the person primarily for us canonizing the 1838 account in our Pearl of Great Price is Orson Pratt. And after reading his evidence there and the historical flow, I am all in on that. It is just such a clear thing that this was the main proponent. Okay, now, where are we time-wise? Oh, gotta hurry. So Orson Pratt then brings it. There are some others that catch on to it, and in particular, there's a couple of artists that catch on. Just like our Anthony Sweat has painted this painting out here for us. In the 1860s, there's an artistic diorama that's painted by C.C.A. Christensen, and he actually begins to take it around as a display to the different saints here along the Wasatch Front. Unfortunately, we don't have a picture of those, okay? But we see the impact of that because other people were influenced by that and Orson's continual preaching about the first vision. And in the 1870s, a hymn writer by the name of George Manwaring actually sits down and over a period of a couple of years puts together a hymn about the first vision. And you will recognize the hymn, I suspect. Okay. In fact, we're going to play you just a few lines. If some of you want to get up and leave now, that might have been the best part of the presentation. But did you notice what happened when you heard that familiar hymn? This was written and first sung in 1878, and guess what happens 2 years later? Orson's been preaching his lungs out about the importance of the first vision, but 2 years later, in General Conference, the 1838 account is canonized. It becomes part of our scriptures. And I find that as no small coincidence, that it begins to enter into the thinking of the saints, and then that acceptance in General Conference. All right, I need to hurry, and I've, unfortunately, in laying the groundwork, I've kind of compromised or threatened to compromise the heart of our research and what we really were commissioned to do when we came here to present today, and that is, we wanted to track then how quickly was the first vision referred to by leaders of the church and in our print magazines, and do we find certain peaks and points of greater emphasis historically in the first vision. And so now that we've established kind of what we mean by the first vision, let me just point out to you this graph here. We took, and the first thing we did is we tracked first vision references in General Conference. And so we were able to go all the way back to, what was our starting date, Katie? 1850 in General Conference. Now, this graph, in a way, needs to be explained because it only gives us a hit on the first vision. And sometimes you might have had a whole talk on the first vision, or you might have had kind of an oblique reference to the first vision and then moving on with the importance of Joseph as a prophet or other things. But nonetheless, it still gives us kind of a sketch as to how frequent the first vision was at first. And you can see in the 1850s, it's just barely getting mentioned. And it's probably all Orson Pratt, quite honestly. Okay, but then you get to the 1880s when it's canonized, and you see that first little portion here, and you see a little bleep there. And it then goes along, and people are trying to get used to it, but there's a great person that steps up to the plate here. You have George Q. Cannon using it a lot and referring to it as a member of the First Presidency, but it was the historian apostle B.H. Roberts, when he includes it in his ecclesiastical history of the church, he then outlines 4 or 5 substantial things from the first vision, and that begins to catch on. And so you notice what happens right after him in conference talks. Boo, it begins to take off. And right in here is kind of the time period of Joseph F. Smith. And Joseph F. Smith is in a very embattled time of the church, and he's having to renounce polygamy and trying to get members of the quorum still to stay active to even leave over the manifesto and things like that. It's a very tumultuous time church-wise because this has been a revelation for the saints. But Joseph F. Smith, as one historian said, wisely refocused the church on guess what doctrine? The first vision. And it catches on, and he preaches so much about the centrality of the first vision that by the time we hit the first anniversary or centennial celebration, you have a real peak there in 1920. Now, these are just individual conference talks, and so sometimes it looks like you have a real tapering off, and it's still a pretty good mention, and it goes through the 1920s and 1930s, and then in the late 1930s you have another seminal event, and that is J. Reuben Clark, a member of the First Presidency. It's a time when there's been a real secularization movement, and you've got scholars coming into BYU Academy and others that are preaching kind of higher criticism of the Bible, and it's also overshadowing Joseph Smith and the Restoration. And J. Reuben Clark stands up there with all the educators present that he has in that gathering, and he says there are 2 fundamentals. In order to be an employee of the church and teach in the church's system, you must teach Jesus is the Christ. It must be a part of your very fiber and your testimony, and you must teach the reality of the first vision. So he kind of really puts it on a pedestal there. Now, this is interesting because these are the war years and the 50s, but guess what is happening in here? The first vitriolic attack on Joseph Smith and his character is being published nationwide by a very popular author, Fawn McKay Brody, the niece of David O. McKay. And her article and her book really summoned the forces of the Lord's leaders to speak out, I believe, on the first vision and just to protect that as be that vanguard. And it crests in 1960. Then there's a tapering here, and then it takes another shot in the arm in the 80s with the Book of Mormon and President Benson and especially President Hinckley. Okay, but notice the end of it begins to taper off again. Okay, that's our time. Okay, you can be the analyst here. All right, now here's the second graph, and then we'll switch to Katie's. Okay, let's see where we go here, Katie. The second graph is not of General Conference talks, but it's of ensign hits on the first vision. And this one, you'll notice you have some spikes in it for the 1920s and for the 1980s and some other spikes. But you see here a much more general upswing and then a little bit of a leveling here, but then a continued climb here, and then once again a little tapering off. It's not nearly as dramatic because now you have many more articles in the Ensign magazine that we're tracking rather than just 20 talks per General Conference. Okay? But you can see this same general trend that we've really had an emphasis and an increased emphasis on the first vision and its importance. Okay, so I'm going to let Katie go ahead and track with our other research.
So I would like to start by just giving a little bit of background. I'm tracking kind of the RLDS Community of Christ path of the first vision. So in 1844, when Joseph Smith Jr. is killed, his oldest son, Joseph Smith III, is 11 years old. And a lot of people believe in lineal succession who are left in Nauvoo, and they believe that Joseph Smith III is kind of the rightful next heir to the presidency of the church, but he is too young and he doesn't really want to take on the presidency of the church anyway. But in 1860, he does decide to take on presidency of the church, and the church is reorganized. And with that reorganization of the church, they start a new paper, which is called the Saints Herald, which is actually the longest running American religious publication in history. And that's been our main data sources. We've been looking at hits for the first vision over time. So if you take a look at this graph, you'll notice that early on, just as the LDS Church isn't talking all that much about the first vision, neither is the RLDS Church. In fact, the first reference that we could find to the first vision in the RLDS tradition is in 1865, and it's a very brief reference. It doesn't go into detail about what Joseph sees. It just says he had his first vision early in the spring of 1820. And it's interesting because this vision is actually mentioned in conjunction with a second vision, which is what the RLDS Church refers to as the angel message, but it's the vision of Moroni. And these are often mentioned in conjunction with one another. As teaching of the first vision is not super common, a historian by the name of Richard Howard has discussed some of the reasons for this. And some of these are the early anti-polygamist sentiment within the reorganized church. They did not believe that polygamy was right, and they denied that Joseph Smith had ever had any polygamous relationships. And so a lot of the publication is actually taken up with propaganda against polygamy. There was also an early focus on the gathering of Zion and getting converts, and lineal succession as the main right to the priesthood. And so a lot of these early publications are focused on Joseph Smith III and his right to the presidency. And so the first vision doesn't really play into that at all. So you'll notice that the first kind of big leap in first vision teaching that we see, let's see, is it that top one? Okay. The first big one that we see is in 1880, which is actually around the same time that the Pearl of Great Price is canonized. And we thought that was really interesting how the RLDS tradition seems to follow the LDS tradition, or they're playing off of each other somehow, and that is just a peak kind of time period in both traditions. After that point, we see rising and rising until 1920, which is when you have the centennial anniversary of the first vision. Just as in the LDS Church, there's a celebration of the first vision and the restoration. In 1948, they hold a restoration festival in which a lot of art and music and poetry and plays are being produced about the restoration, and the first vision is of course a part of that, and so that's another big peak period. During this time, all of the presidents of the church are lineal heirs of Joseph Smith Jr. and Joseph Smith III. And Joseph Smith III, his last son that comes into presidency of the church goes by the name of W. Wallace Smith. And he is actually one of the most influential characters in moving the church more towards mainline Christianity. Him and some of these other leaders listed up here, including Clifford Cole, Charles Neff, and Robert Flanders. So a key event in the transition of the RLDS Church away from the First Vision is the Joint Council Seminars of 1967. This is when you have a bunch of RLDS church leaders, including, this is W. Wallace Smith up here, including W. Wallace Smith, meet with Protestant seminary professors and ministers. And there's an interesting interchange that's been noted by an RLDS historian named Mark Scherer, where W. Paul Jones, who's one of these Protestant professors, asks a question to W. Wallace Smith. He asks, if our mutual studies of Scripture were to reveal a discrepancy between the teachings of Jesus Christ and the teachings of Joseph Smith, which would you accept? This is an interesting dichotomy that I'm not going to get into, but W. Wallace Smith actually buys into this dichotomy and says, well, of course we'd have to go with Jesus. Another really influential character in shaping RLDS teaching of the First Vision is a man by the name of Clifford Cole. He spent a lot of his youth living with a Presbyterian minister and his family, and was very influenced by their ways of thinking. And so when he comes into church leadership, he is very firm on leaving behind the distinctives. And distinctives are things like the First Vision, the Book of Mormon, and for us, temple ordinances. So he has this interesting quote right here where he says, they've been grounded in Joseph Smith and the Grove and the Book of Mormon. Let's leave the distinctives and believe most in Christ. Again, you see that dichotomy coming up where you can't have Jesus Christ and Joseph Smith in the same kind of room. And then as he's talking about his own personal journey to accepting the RLDS Church, he says, I came to the conclusion that the Latter-day Church had as much validity as any, that if the experiences that Joseph had related were not true, or if they had been twisted and exaggerated by generations, that would still make the Latter-day Saint Church as valid as the Presbyterian Church or any other church. I think that's a really interesting thing to note, that he says it's as valid as any other church. No longer is it, we are the one true church. It's, we're a valid church just like any other church. So their way of thinking seems to have influenced the way that the language shifts in talking about the First Vision as well. In the 1960s, as Brother Wilson mentioned, there is the discovery of that account of the 1832 account of the First Vision, which has a more personal kind of take on the First Vision. And so the language that the RLDS Church is using during this time shifts from the kind of institutionalized, like two personages, pillar of light language that we associate with the First Vision to an association with Joseph Smith's personal quest for repentance. So we've kind of dubbed these terms the shift from institutional theophany to a personal epiphany account of Joseph Smith's First Vision. That's kind of the year by year. So in 1986, there's this interesting lesson excerpt that I found within the Herald that uses a couple of different First Vision accounts. The 1842 account is actually the most commonly used account of the First Vision by the RLDS Church, but this lesson actually switches tacks about halfway through talking about the First Vision. So as they go on, they describe Joseph Smith's, his desire to find truth, but as soon as he gets to the Grove, it switches to the 1832 account, which is that more abstract account where Joseph Smith is just seeking for personal repentance, and it doesn't mention whether it was one being or two, and it's just a lot more abstract, and they're kind of buying into that. And anyways, I thought that was a really interesting kind of thing to note. So after that point, we do see a brief kind of upsurge in kind of hearkening back to the First Vision in the 150th anniversary of the church in 1980, but that's very brief, and after that, the flame sort of dies down again. In 2001, the RLDS Church is renamed the Community of Christ, and since that time, teaching of the First Vision has all but disappeared. In the last couple of years that I've looked at, there's been maybe 2 or 3 references to the First Vision at all. You can find on the Community of Christ's current website this brief snippet. This is their explanation of the First Vision today. And it says, Joseph Smith Jr. was the founder of our movement. His story began as a teenage boy kneeling in the woods in upstate New York, praying for answers to religious questions that had divided his family and neighbors. The guidance he received in the grove began a lifelong journey with God. There is no mention of the first vision itself. You don't have any mention of what Joseph Smith saw or experienced here. And I thought that was interesting. And just understanding that the community of Christ has moved away from the first vision as a seminal event in the founding of the church. So over here, we've kind of overlaid the Saints Herald trajectory as well as the Improvement Era and Ensign trajectories in talking about the first vision. And Brother Wilson, I think, has a couple things to say about that.
Thanks, Katie. You can tell why I had to have her along, can't you? She's been a gold mine in terms of our research. But here's our basic research following, and this is probably the most parallel data sources that we could find, namely our Ensign and Improvement Era that preceded our Ensign and mention of the first vision, and the Saints Herald from the RLDS side, Saints Herald being the blue line here, and ours being the brown line here, the light brown line. And you'll notice that they largely track together. Okay, even though it's interesting, these are times when we're in competition with each other as two faiths. But we're pretty unified when we are talking about the importance of the first vision. But then you get to this point of divergence, which is 1950, and that's when the leadership of the RLDS Church begins to change, and when the president of the church does not really want to define and set doctrinal tones. He's in the third family of the Joseph Smith III sons, and he never expected to be president. And so when he's called to be president, he hasn't been an apostle or anything. He was a hardware salesman out in Portland, Oregon. And he then comes into the office of presidency, but he's a consensus builder, and so he surrounds himself with other leaders. And he particularly chooses leaders that are not well grounded and that have been influenced by Protestant theology, and that's where you see this really strong, as Katie described, divergence and really a retraction to where the first vision becomes a non-doctrine for the church in the community of Christ. Our trajectory, for those that really espouse the first vision, it continues on a nice upward trend. And it has this sharp peak right here with people like President Hinckley. Joseph Fielding McConkie, a former faculty member, writes a book, Here We Stand, parroting the Martin Luther, Here I Stand, but his was Here We Stand, namely we stand on the first vision. Okay, and so those kinds of things are the late 90s and the early 2000s. And then we also see somewhat of a tapering in our own magazines and articles and references to this. So to kind of tie this all together, I can recall a time back 20 years ago when I took my family to the Community of Christ Sanctuary, the temple there in Independence, and I wanted my children, we were doing the historical sites, I wanted them to see how the RLDS believed in things, and so we went there, and there's a tour there during the summer, and they have interns that take you on the tour, and you enter this glass panel, which is inscribed with trees, or looks almost like a grove, and then it's called the Worshipper's Path, and those of you that have been back will remember it kind of winds up and around, and they have different stations declaring their faith, and then you end up in their sanctuary. Okay, and you have a Station of the Cross, and they talk about that, and it's a well done little progression. But as we ended there in the sanctuary, and we had our intern was just asking us at the end of the tour, do you have any questions? I did, and I phrased my question rather pointedly. I said, I've seen lots of references to other things, even the Book of Mormon and the atonement and things, but nowhere do I see a reference in your pathway or to Joseph Smith and the first vision. And I said, does the church still believe in the first vision? And this was 20 years ago, and this young intern looked at me and smiled and said, it's interesting that you ask. I suspect it depends on which generation you're talking to in the church. And I thought to myself, I kind of ached because of the movement away from this seminal doctrine with the importance that I attach to it. But then again, I am kind of concerned about this sort of a pattern where we notice, and I'm just making an observation. I'm not here to change the church or anything, but since the year 2000, even in our publications and things, there has been a lesser influence and mentioning of the first vision. In fact, today in my classes, I took a poll of my students. This was from yesterday's classes of 250 students, and I said, how many of you have been to the Sacred Grove? Only 38. Guess how many had been to Disneyland? Over 90% had been to Disneyland. Today, with my freshmen and my younger students, guess what the number was that had been out of the 250 students that I taught today? 26% had been to the Sacred Grove. There has been a lesser emphasis, I'm afraid, and it's not to say that our emphasis on Jesus Christ and the family and being great Christians and followers of Jesus Christ is ill-placed, but I believe we also need space for the first vision as a part of our seminal core. And so I'm thrilled to see the year 2020 and to see long before we even get to that year, to see the prophet starting to step forward and admonish us. This will be a great commemoration. I encourage all of you to refresh that. And I wanted to end with an excerpt from one of President Hinckley's comments on the first vision. Okay, so let's see if I'm techie enough I can do this. Uh-oh, did I do? Uh-oh, not Stevens. Okay.
Our entire case as members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints rests on the validity of this glorious first vision. It was the parting of the curtain to open the dispensation of the fullness of times. Nothing on which we base our doctrine, nothing we teach, nothing we live by is of greater importance than this initial declaration. I submit that if Joseph Smith talked with God the Father and his beloved Son, then all else of which he spoke is true. This is the hinge on which turns the gate that leads to the path of salvation and eternal life.
Now, I have had rich association with RLDS historians and with RLDS Community of Christ leaders. And it's with some deep feelings of remorse and loss as I hear them talk about moving away from a subjective experience that Joseph had and becoming more Christian. I believe in my heart of hearts that the first vision makes us the deepest Christians of all. And I pray that we can continue, just as President Hinckley admonished us, to keep that as a central part of our faith in this great restoration and becoming true disciples of Jesus Christ. And I say that in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. All right. Oh, we've run out of time. No questions. Okay. All right. Ryan, do you want to moderate that?
Thank you so much for that wonderful lecture, wonderful presentation. I know we all have learned much from this. We do have about 10 minutes, if you don't mind, for some questions. And so what I'm going to ask is that if you just want to say your question, if you can answer it, maybe restate
Sure.
the question, and then we'll just go from there.
Go right ahead.
I'm troubled by the terminology vision. Stephen had a vision into heaven. Joseph Smith had a vision with the 76th session looking into heaven. I prefer the terminology visitation because the Father and the Son were here on earth in his presence in a grove.
If you couldn't hear that comment, your first name is? Dan. Dan brought up the issue of nomenclature with titling the first vision a vision. and referring to others that have had a vision and kind of looking up into heaven. But Dan's point was this was an appearance, okay, and the Father and the Son were here. Okay, and the likes, and so talking about it as a visitation is a much more explicit kind of mortal context for that, and I think Dan has a fairly good point. It's just that we've referred to a time when God meets man in sort of a visionary experience, and I believe it probably is even wrapped up in kind of a transfiguration kind of thing, because that has to be going on in those kinds of experiences where a mortal is in the presence of God. And so I think that the nomenclature that's been used then has been vision, but your point's well taken. Stephen, what would you say to that? Do I dare lean on you? Oh, good, man. If I have his backing, then I'm secure. All right. Any others? Good question. Go ahead.
So, from your research, it kind of showed that the past 10 years, there's been a taking off of the reference and use of the first vision. Do you have anything you can attribute that to, or?
This is just really a subjective kind of analysis. I'm not sure we can claim that we have a silver bullet that points to it, but when you look back in the last 10 to 15 years, there might be some dealing with President Monson's kind of leadership, and I don't say that in a pejorative way, but that he tend to focus more on the gospel of compassion and reaching out, and he was that great storyteller. Early on in his time as an apostle and a president, he speaks much more frequently of the first vision and the restoration. But in the later years of his life, it seemed like he went more to this compassionate approach, and that's just purely my subjective kind of analysis there. I think also there have been some very strong social issues that have been troubling for the church, that the church has been dealing with women's issues in the church, with the sanctity of marriage and family, and the same-sex attraction issues, and I think those have been really loud and screaming loud issues. And so I believe the leadership has been trying to kind of address their conference talks and other things in that direction. But yours is a good question, and I probably should have restated it, but it was any explanation for why the last 10 or 15 years there's been less emphasis. Now, you will note from that one graph that we showed that it's not the same falling off that the first graph seemed to track with just a solid line, but it's just a little lessening of that emphasis. But you still had some emphases in there. Okay, yeah, please go ahead. Good question.
My question is, in the 1950 celebration the LDS Church did of the restoration of music and the festival kind of thing, did they use any of our music or art, or did they have all their own independent music and art?
Katy is here to answer your question.
So a lot of it is original like art and poetry and things like that. They do sing, I think, a couple times the one that we played today, the "Oh How Lovely Was the Morning." That's the only reference that I found. Mm-hmm.
They had to use that one. It was so inspired, Okay, let's see. Right back here. Go ahead.
So you mentioned how the first vision was primarily enshrined in our religious consciousness by Orson Pratt. So can you tell us a little bit about why that was? Was that something he got directly from Joseph Smith? Like, you should share this more often, or was it something that he was just inspired by?
That's a great question. What was your first name?
John.
John. Now, this is just me trying to put the puzzle pieces together, and Stephen's done really good work on this, so you might want to ask him the same question. But my take on that is, in the 1840 encounter where Orson meets Joseph Smith, okay, out there on the road as he's going to his mission, and Joseph is returning to Nauvoo, it seems like he gets firsthand explanation of the 1838 account from the prophet, and it must have just burned a real seared him with that information, and he just wants to talk about that, so he immediately writes it down, and he does the first published account, even though it's not verbatim as what we have in the 1838 account. It's quite close, and it's this Remarkable Visions pamphlet that he produces over in England. And then I think, you'll notice this. Have I got any returned mission presidents here in the audience? Okay. When we send out somebody from our faculty on a mission as a mission president, and they come back and they teach after that, they teach differently in religious ed. And they teach much more the first vision and the centrality of Joseph Smith and the Book of Mormon, those things that convert. And I think that got into Orson's missionary DNA, and he just started preaching that, and it became a part of him. And then when he came back, no change at all. He just continues to go right with that. Now, there are others certainly that are still mentioning it, but he is the main person that's standing up as an apostle and teaching the first vision. Okay? Good question. Yeah, go ahead, Levere.
Keith, you're mentioning on the social issue thing, and it seems to me that the importance, of course, of the first vision and so on certainly hasn't changed. In fact, it's very viable. But because of the way media is nowadays, that the brethren avoid just a little bit controversial issues so as not to have some prime half sentences for them to pull out and to criticize.
Yeah, if you couldn't hear it, Levere's comment was perhaps there's a little movement or hesitancy with the explicitness of the first vision in the 1838 account, because it makes for perfect negative sound bites against the church in terms of they all are an abomination and things like that. And so perhaps there's a hesitancy or a little bit of a buffering, not wanting, and Jack Welch and other scholars have done a really good job of pointing out that that might be actually a denunciation of creeds, specific creeds, rather than of all of Christianity being treated as the term creed or faith. Okay, but nonetheless, Levere, I think your comments, there could really be something to that as they still teach the first vision, but wanting to soften some of the polemical edges of it a little bit. Okay. Now it's interesting, the RLDS Church, they don't want to take the LDS version of the first vision, and so they run almost completely with the 1842 account, which also diminishes those edges a little bit. Okay, really good. Yeah, Tonalyn?
I was just wondering, a lot of those that have broken with Community of Christ, particularly after the ordination of women, will continue to talk about the angel message and first vision and whatnot. I'm wondering if in your map, if you had seen a drop-off right at that moment of the ordination of women.
That's a really good observation, because, see, things really change in the Community of Christ, in RLDS Church, with the ordination of women in 1984. Their DNC 156. And that's when you have the groups, and you have your first formal groups leaving and coalescing in the 90s, and you have 3 to 4 major groups of people leaving. The RLDS Church has had a huge exodus. In 1978, they had over 80,000 full tithe payers. Today they have under 10,000. Okay, and so these groups have split away. And Tonalyn's question is, they tend to be the old RLDS that are trying to hold on to more the first vision. And I've got to go back, and I have good contacts with those people. I've got to see if I can explore some data, because I'll bet their referencing the first vision is just as high as ours. Yeah. Yeah, and get some digital copies and run this same study on those. Oh, I thought I was done with this, but you're, tossing out the gauntlet. Okay, Dan, go ahead.
Do they still believe in tithing doctrinally?
Oh, sure. Yeah. The Community of Christ have adopted a really softened position to tithing, and that is any charitable donation you make to any organization can count as tithing. And they haven't pressed the hard and fast 10% that our church has, and it's really come back to bite them, because their donations are just dwindling so quickly. All right, one more, and then we'll let you go for the Zupa juice or whatever. Go ahead.
Did you trace the revelation about the power of darkness in the LDS tradition and the RLDS traditions that was part of the first vision? The revelation of
Yeah. No, we didn't, and that would be quite a fascinating secondary study to see about that, because especially in the church today, there's this very much a much softer version of Christianity, kind of social Christianity, and reaching out and peace mission and things. Those are some of the primary emphases, and so something like the doctrine of Satan would be way down the list, and it'd be an interesting study to kind of trace that and see the divergence there. Okay, all right. Thanks so much.